Let's get it.
We are people who have historically been on the verge of extinction. We have been many times under much stress since being brought into this country on many slave ships. Reparations from segregation. Genius at Genesis, master system saviors. Punjabi mommy, dissect invaders on Sepulveda. Anointed players who call phrases, metal paper. Level layers, several shades of gray, a submission forward. MILF lover, under silk covers who kiss her horses. Pilates century to preserving the body temple. Jazz classics, combating the fattest ass status. Quotient. My potion soaking like boats and oceans. Motion sickness, I overdid out my finesse pack. Multi-decking new refreshment lessons from jet snaps. My mama wisdom, my competition is setbacks. Jet lagging, very swagging, my Jordans dirty. AMG performance, my foreign don't show no mercy. Mere products, objects meaningless to the overstanders. Contemplating with industrialists and social planners. Manillas. Don't run us, 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 don't run us. Life's work overseeing the five classics. You can accomplish anything if you survive blackness.
Don't ruin us, don't ruin us. Yo, greetings everybody, greetings, and welcome to Coblow'S Daily Therapy, reading from the book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on African Americans from Colonial times to the present, by Harriet A. Washington. I will repeat, Medical Apartheid, right there, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present time. That means all the way back from when they colonized Africa and all the other places they colonized up until today, experimenting preferably on Black people, exploiting, putting us on display, charging people to watch us be dissected, amputating people's limbs just to prove that they had a good prowess about themselves, that they were real good at what they did. They call some of these terrorists and sadists the fathers of gynecology. And a lot of white women get to owe their health to the study that was done on Black women, research, observation, not treatment. Most of the time, Black people went to the hospitals back in the past. They did not get treatment. They were observed. They were researched. They were studied for the benefit of another class of people. They talked about certain individuals like Oda Bing or Sarah Bartman that were put on display. People charged and paid money to see them act a fool and to throw stuff at them and poke them like animals. People that had horns implanted in their heads so they could be displayed and portrayed to be half animal, half human. Black people. Consistent. It's a consistent pattern with us being the ones exploited, us being the ones mistreated, us being the ones abused, us being the ones dissected, experimented on. Hospitals, Black colleges named after these doctors that robbed graves, stole Black bodies, all for experiment. So many instances, man. Funeral homes, schools, old jars and bodies of jars of body parts and stuff. I mean, man, it goes on and on and on. The mistreatment of our body. Documented in American Medical Journal. Doctors and scholars and people of education saying that the time invested in educating a Black man or a Black person was a waste, and that our biggest value would be to the laboratory. They felt like our quality, our worth, our value was most valued. Had more worth in the lab. On top of that, let me hit you with one that's even deeper. They said that we could never be cured of diseases because we were hypersensitive. We were just nasty. We didn't have no control over our organs. To the point where they said that black people in America, African American, me and you, that me, you, and my granddaddy, and your granddaddy, my grandmama, your grandmama, would be extinct by the year 2000. That's America. American youth. So let's get started, man. I'm on part 2. Part 2 is titled The Usual Subjects, not the usual suspects, the usual subjects, which is always us when somebody's being tested or exploited or experimented on. And I'm on chapter 9. Chapter 9 is titled Nuclear Winter. Radiation Experiments on African Americans. Once again, like I said, chapter 9 continue. I'm in the middle of chapter 9. I'm actually going to finish chapter 9 today. Nuclear Winter. Radiation Experiments on African Americans. Don't be startled. Don't be surprised. They even fed our babies to alligators. Plutonium injections in the human body. Let me get started. Martha Stevens, a University of Cincinnati English professor, has written The Treatment, a comprehensive and unflinching history of the TBI test. Its chapters describe the long, bitter fight for justice that finally culminated in a $5 million 1999 settlement between 13 researchers and the subject's survivors. The agreement also stipulated that the university would erect a permanent memorial naming the victims, and in June 2010, it complied by installing a small, curiously dated plaque label dedicated to the patients of the radiation experimentation, 1973 to 1974, and listing the names of over 170 patients. The plaque was placed on the medical school grounds behind a dumpster and nestled between the kitchen and a parking garage. Sanger's use of mostly black subjects was a matter of convenience and culture. That's what Americans are hooked on now, especially black people. We hooked on convenience now. We done adapted the American way better than America. Sanger's use of mostly black subjects was a matter of convenience and culture by other radiation experiments, but other radiation experiments offered scientific rationale for deliberately targeting black subjects. Like the scientific racists of a century earlier, investigators wished to demonstrate that blacks would respond differently to radiation's medical danger. The design of such experiments required African American subjects. Many such experiments were conducted at the Medical College of Virginia, MCV, part of Virginia Commonwealth University. Between 1949 and 1960, the MCV was home to a secret metabolic laboratory whose principal focus was the Army's preparation for massive nuclear casualties. MCV was chosen in part because it was a heavily research-oriented school in the South, and the government had a particular interest in black subjects. They said government. Take heed of that word right there. For example, one MCV experiment sought to determine whether radiation inflicted different degrees of damage on the skin of black people than on that of whites. In 1947, Everett Idris Evans, at the behest of the Surgeon General of the Army, set up the nation's first civilian burn unit in MCV, funded by the Army. Evans planned to compare the burn injuries radiation caused in whites to those it caused in blacks. Some were charity patients who had been severely burned in accidents and whose use as experimental material constituted, quote, payment for their care by MCV staff. The MCV researchers deliberately caused third-degree burns to the skins of other patients at Dooley, a charity hospital for black children. They caused third-degree burns intentionally. A charity hospital for black children, and at St. Philip's, its sister hospital for black adults. These hospitals eventually yielded 100 black subjects a year between the ages of 6 months and 90 years 90 years for similar MCV burn experiments. Doctors use radiation emitted at graduated levels to measure the precise amount of energy necessary to induce specific levels of first to third degree burn. Why didn't they just use some skin from an animal, from a dead animal like that? Let me see. Doctors use radiation emitted. Okay. Investigators also produced the radiation burns on the arms of 44 whites at different area hospitals, and at least in some cases, scientists acknowledged that these were produced for, quote, investigational purposes, end quote. The doctors and radiation physicians used their data to calculate the numbers of people who would die at specific distances from a nuclear bomb like that detonated over Hiroshima, approximately 20 kilotons. Evans' team deduced that blacks suffered more intense burns than whites after the same exposure. And from this, researchers concluded that radiation burns from a nuclear event would injure blacks much more severely than whites. Another experimental group of 460 black and 770 white patients in the Medical College of Virginia was injected with a variety of radioactive substances, including phosphorus 32, without their consent. Blacks made up 37% of those experimental subjects, nearly 4 times their representation in the population of the United States. The AEC also sponsored 15 other radiation studies on 300 black patients at New Orleans Charity Hospital. The studies were conducted by Tulane University physicians. The most toxic of these experiments involved dispensing mercury, and yet another study of disparate racial reactions to radiation. 22 black patients were made to swallow radioactive mercury in order to calibrate its symptoms and the length of time the body took to excrete the toxic metal. In another Tulane experiment, doctors surreptitiously placed radioactive mercury into the open sores that remained just after they had removed blisters from a dozen, quote, colors, end quote, and 3 white patients in order to judge the metal's effects on healing time. They amassed no clinically meaningful data. Despite the MCV findings, the blacks were more vulnerable to radiation burn damage. An illogical belief persisted among doctors and radiologic technicians that African Americans could tolerate increased amounts of radiation than could whites without ill effect, which that sounds like a contradiction. Like the belief that blacks better tolerate pain than do whites, this stubborn myth gave license to conduct painful and dangerous experimental radiation practice. In 1968, consumer activist Ralph Nader, I think he's still alive, complained to the Washington Post about the nationwide practice of, quote, giving Negroes 25 to 50% stronger X-ray doses than white patients, end quote. G.J. Charlton, a professor of radiology at the predominantly black Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, swiftly dismissed the claim as a, quote, a fantastic charge, end quote. But California radiologic technicians conducting a 1966 survey revealed that 75 or 72% of the state's X-ray technicians had opted on their own initiative to administer those higher X-ray exposure to blacks because of their vague beliefs that African Americans were physiologically different. End quote. Well, now, quote, their bones are harder and denser. Their skin is darker. Their flesh is tougher, end quote. Physicians from the Public Health Service and the American College of Radiology denied ever issuing such advisories to doctors, but it was technicians, not doctors, who were making the experimental adjustments without citing their actions in the official medical records. Also, despite the denials, physicians were being taught to administer higher than indicated radiation doses to blacks. For example, the 1963 edition of X-ray Technology by Charles A. Jacoby and Don Q. Parrish, a standard textbook, contained a charted recommendation that the standard radiation doses should be increased for Negro X-ray patients. In 1968, a study commissioned by Bernard Goldman, director of the New York State Bureau of X-ray, also found that a, quote, significant portion, end quote, of technicians had exposed blacks to higher radiation doses than whites, leading the New York State Health Department to specifically prohibit the practice. Discrimination against black people at all angles. There were many other racially mediated radiation experiments. For example, the AEC irradiated 235 African-American newborns in 1953 through 1954 in various hospitals across the nation, but the released radiation records give very sparse details. However, we know that biophysics professor Dr. Lester Van Middlesworth injected each of 6 black newborns with 1.5 microcurrents of radioactive iodine, 131, in a 1940 program at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. Records also reveal that 6 of the 7 infants injected at John Gaston Hospital, a non-defunct public hospital in Memphis, were also black, and their doctors measured their uptake of iodine, which targets the thyroid gland, 24 hours later so that they could learn more about how the gland functions in infants. Today, radioactive tracers are used for therapeutic or screening purposes in similar, safer amounts. No one should avoid such tests, which trade a low radiation risk for significant health benefits, but these were not therapeutic injections, and the risks were unjustifiable. The experimental use of radiation to harm and to stigmatize African Americans is not entirely relegated to the distant past. In 1978, scientists revisited an experiment that had been conducted between 1940 and 1959 at several sites, including New York University Hospital. These scientists irradiated the scalps of 2,500 children, 625 of them black, to treat their tenial capitis, or ringworm. Without notification to their parents, children were taken from classrooms for their X-ray treatments, and their burns and side effects were carefully assessed, raising the question whether the X-ray treatments were chiefly experimental rather than therapeutic in nature. Blacks made up 9.8% of the U.S. population in 1940, so these children were represented at 2.5 times the rate in the population. Between 1910 and 1959, before effective topical medications were developed, 200,000 children, we'll repeat that, 200,000 children around the world received about 170 rands each for treatment of ringworm, radiation for treatment of ringworm. But by 1940, when NYU irradiated children, researchers had known for over 25 years that this level of radiation was extremely dangerous, and the standard treatment for ringworm was not irradiation, but ultraviolet light or topical chemotherapy. In 1978, the American Journal of Public Health published an article in which NYU researchers assessed the psychiatric results this irradiation had on the developing brains of 177 of the subjects. They administered the Minnesota Multifaces Personality Inventory, MMPI, to 118 whites and 59 blacks. NYU had included in the experiment a control group of 1,800 children who had been treated with chemotherapy, 450 of whom, or 25%, were black. Researchers found more psychological symptoms and deviant personality scores among adult whites who had been treated by radiation than among those who had been treated with topical medication. But they found that the radiation-treated black subjects had no more psychiatric symptoms than medically treated blacks, and this suggested to them that radiation levels that could cause brain damage in whites did not affect blacks. Quote, some researchers have suggested brain insults at birth have relatively less impact among blacks on the risk of subsequent neuropsychiatric disorders than among whites, end quote, the article stated. This conclusion recalls both the baseless belief that higher doses of radiation were needed in blacks to produce the same efforts as in whites, and the previously discussed belief that some disorders such as syphilis and tuberculosis affect blacks in a manner that spares their nervous system and brain. However, investigators admitted to serious flaws in their experimental design. The MMPI is ethnically biased and less sensitive in discerning pathology among African Americans. Also, researchers tested fewer than 10% of the original subjects, and this small sample size may also have distorted the results. Next, passage. Last passage. Black body radiation. Quote, in more cases than not, the victims are African Americans. You're dealing with the majority of people of African American descent. My mother thinks it's a grand scale plan, end quote, insists Elmerine Whitfield Bell. Is she right? For some radiation research programs, the racial breakdown has been obscured by the engineered atmosphere of deceit and secrecy. Even patients' names are missing, lost forever with case records. But all extant data indicate that a higher number of African Americans than whites were used in many clandestine radiation experiments. As mentioned earlier, subject advocate E. Cooper Brown of the National Committee of Radiation Victims estimated that 3 of every 5 radiation victims were people of color. 75% of the subjects in the University of Cincinnati irradiation experiments were African American. But the real significance in the fact that African Americans were typically used in significantly greater proportions than the 10 to 12% of the population they have constituted. In 1993, DOE Secretary Hazel O'Leary, the first African American to hold that position, displayed refreshing candor as she reacted to graphic press allegations of the government's experimentation on its own citizens. She admitted the agency's guilt and ordered the selective declassification of vital nuclear information. In December 1993, she ordered the opening of all DOE records of the 435 human radiation experiments conducted between 1944 and the 1990s. O'Leary's investigation ushered in a new atmosphere of openness to replace decades of Machiavellian Cold War secretiveness. As she explained, quote, we've learned that openness helps to bring a corrective to government, and quickly, end quote. She ordered 665 cubic feet of original declassified documents and investigation results stored in the National Archives and mounted on DOE websites. This is the sort of forthrightness that would have prevented the investigative failures of the Tuskegee ad hoc committee. On January 15, 1994, President Clinton created the Advisory Committee on Human Radiation Experiments, ACHRL, to investigate fully the genesis of these experiments, and to judge them. The committee was also charged with making sure that these abuses could never be repeated. Clinton also issued an apology on October 3rd, 1995, but few seem to know this. It was drowned out by the din that accompanied the O.J. Simpson verdict, which was announced a few hours later. Clinton's brief remarks did not mention any racial component of the study. The revelations of the committee facilitated civil lawsuits brought against the government and universities by hundreds of victims and survivors. Some cases have been successful, such as those mounted by the chiefly black victims of the Cincinnati TBI experiment. Others are still being contested. However, the ACHRE chose to interview the researchers and publish the resultant oral histories instead of charging them with crime. None of the physicians conducting the radiation experiments were ever placed on trial. The radiation experiments captured a moment when an important group of physician scientists ceased to view themselves as healers and benefactors first, with disastrous results for their victims and for American medicine. For African Americans, the full cost in lost health and lost trust are still being reckoned. Even today, events occasionally remind us that racism and radiation experimentation remain linked at locations such as the Savannah River site. Locals call it simply the, quote, SRS, located just outside Aiken, South Carolina, owned by the DOE and managed by the South Carolina's Westinghouse Savannah River Corporation, WSRC. Westinghouse is a key word. They had a company here in Calhoun County. This high-tech manufacturing facility once produced tritium and plutonium-239 for nuclear weapons. Now that the Cold War has abated, it processes nuclear waste. Approximately 2,800 of the SRS's 14,000 employees are Black. And by 2002, they had filed at least 22 lawsuits. These complained that Black employees were denied promotions, were subjected to racist graffiti, found nooses hanging in their lockers, and were subjected to higher radiation levels than were whites. Quote, we have disciplined employees, including terminating an employee for incidents involving nooses, end quote. WSRC President Robert Petty confirmed for the Augusta Chronicle in 2002. In 1997, the Department of Labor ordered Westinghouse to compensate 7 Black SRS workers. So people that might be checking this out, that worked at Westinghouse on the depot in Anson, Alabama, might need to check into that. They might have had some of the same issues. But even worse, Blacks complain that they are relegated to the high radiation areas of the plant, dubbed the coon areas by whites. James Rutenberg of the University of Colorado School of Medicine assessed employee radiation readings between 1991 and 1998 using their dosimeters, individual radiation counters. His findings corroborate these workers' claims. When all annual dose measurements are grouped by race, the doses for Blacks are higher than for whites in all dose categories. The annual penetrating doses for Blacks are about 1.8 times as high as the doses for whites. The analysis supports the hypothesis that these differences are due to the job placement practices that put Blacks in jobs that have higher radiation exposures than whites. And that never fails, that Black people always get put in the most hazardous, most dangerous jobs. Yet their requests for transfer to safer areas have been denied. Jimmy Walker, for example, inhaled plutonium at the plant in 1977. Wow, he inhaled it. This drove his exposure beyond the permitted lifetime dose of 50 reams. A ream is a measure of radiation dose, essentially a rad that is adjusted for its biological effect. In 2002, after multiple permanent transfer requests were ignored, his radiation level soared to more than 80 reams, nearly twice the permitted lifetime exposure. And he retired at age 48 in poor health. The exposures also placed Walker at risk of becoming an experimental subject. At a 2002 checkup, a company doctor pressed into Walker's hands a leaflet suggesting he donate his body to a radiation research project at Washington State University. In return, his family would receive 500 measly funky dollars. Quote, I feel betrayed by the company, by the government, end quote. Walker told London's independent newspaper in 2002, quote, now they have admitted the radiation causes cancer. All the time, they were telling me there was nothing to worry about, end quote. By 2002, they paid out $25 million to Black workers in 62 settlements, but the company admits no wrongdoing. And then a lot of times that's a part of the agreement, the settlement, is that you can't disclose the the terms of the agreement, and they don't admit any wrongdoing. We just gonna pay you though, but we ain't gonna admit we did wrong. That's goofy. African American radiation victims are neither silent nor passive. Elmer Allen's daughter, Elmarine Whitfield Bell, is an activist who challenges abusive experimentation and refuses to let the memory of her father and the other radiation victims fade from memory with the headline. Quote, what I really want to come from this, Bell says, is some type of coalition of victims and survivors of radiation treatments and experiments so that we can get together and really speak to the issue on a national and on an international basis. I'm determined that as long as I breathe, I will address the issue of radiation and how to eradicate this sort of experimentation from the earth. It will always be used against poor folk, and we have something to do, end quote. And that is the end of that chapter. Tomorrow, I'll be on chapter 10. Chapter 10, caged subjects. And once again, you just tell by the title of the chapter that it's going to be that work. It's going to be that business. It's going to be something serious. Once again, something else that's mind-blowing, something that's eye-opening and revealing, something that wakes you up and lets you know the reality of our existence over here in this good old USA. But you know what they say, though? You're going to keep something from a black man, just put it in a book. He ain't going to go in there and get it, but look at me. I go in there and get it. Rico always doing something, ain't he? Yup. Rico go in there, he'll get it, he'll find it, he'll bring it to you. He look at this information that's in these books just like it's water. And without water, we can't survive. So we need this. We need this knowledge and information to make it further for our future generations to survive. Like I said earlier, they had a plan, and I ain't going to even say they planned. They predicted that we would be extinct by the year 2000. But look at us. We still here. And y'all didn't even know that. A lot of people don't even know that they predicted African Americans, not black people, African Americans, us, be extinct. That was a prediction. And they said it. So they let you know what they think about us. But at the same time, the reality of it is that when you look and see that we still here, it lets you know we ain't going nowhere. They don't know what they're talking about. We way stronger than what they say. So I'm going to go get that work and I'm going to bring it to you. And first off, let me thank y'all for tuning in and getting this work. I'm going to get up out of here, y'all. It's Coco, baby. I'm God, baby. Coblow'S. Peace.